All right, let's go. What's up, everybody? Thank you for coming to the channel. And let's get some based analyzation in here today. Thank you for coming to my channel. Today we're going to be covering Sylvia Plath and some Ted Hughes. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. We've been doing British Romantic era poetry, and we've done quite a bit so far. You know, we've done Renaissance, we've done Romantic era, we've talked about the Neoclassical era, and today we're going to be going into the modern era. We delved into that a little bit, into the early modernist era in literature with Ezra Pound, Wilfred Owen, and some other poets. But today we're going to switch gears a little bit and go to mid 20th century and cover some Sylvia Plath. So before we get started, as usual with the channel, please see the links in my channel description and see in the chat, if you're there right now, the PayPal and the Cash App links. I would really appreciate it very much because we're trying to get the channel going, as we've been saying. So shout out to all my homies out there watching this. Shout out to Eliana. Yes, thank you for being here. Crispy, Kristen, ADH, A Devotional Heart. Go like and subscribe to her channel on YouTube. And to my homeboy Jerry at Exposing Powerful Lies live streams, please like and share his videos. Go to his channel. So today, again, we're going to be going into Sylvia Plath and the modern era, what we would call confessional poetry. I thought this would be interesting, just kind of because we've been talking about some dark material recently, not his dark materials, all that. We've been talking about dark literature, especially with the Byron stream that we just did. So I thought we would kind of go with that because when we get into Sylvia Plath, anybody, you know, you're watching this, you probably know, you know, or you've heard of Sylvia Plath, but we're going to go a little deeper, and we're going to go to the source material, to the text, look at a few of her poems and see what this is all about, because this ties in with a lot of issues that are going on now, that have been going on for a while, namely socio-political issues. So we're going to go to some of the source material, right? Thank you, ADH, Devotional Heart. I appreciate you. Thank you, Jerry. So, and we're also, when we're talking about Sylvia Plath, we're, of course, going to talk about Ted Hughes. Now, not every analysis of Sylvia Plath will include Ted Hughes. In fact, many will purposefully leave him out, but we're not going to leave him out. We're going to go into it because that plays an important role when talking about her own body of work. I'm not really sure where to start with this one, except for to just show you a couple of books of Sylvia Plath and maybe some Ted Hughes here. Now, again, you know, we're going to try and dive a little deep into this and look at the text. And this is for, you know, you may appreciate this if you remember this from high school, especially from the 90s. Reason I have the pic up there with Kathleen Hanna. You may recognize Kathleen Hanna if you're if you grew up in the 90s. Kathleen Hanna, lead singer of Bikini Kill and later Le Tigre. And Bikini Kill, of course, has a song, Sylvia Plath. And later on, Sylvia Plath plays an influential role in zines and in the Riot Girl movement. Right, in terms of punk rock. So we're going to talk about that. I've always liked Kathleen Hanna. I always thought I've always liked her. And I've got all the Bikini Kills albums. I've got Le Tigre, and I was just listening to Babes in Toyland from the 90s. If you're from the 90s, you may remember Babes in Toyland because of MTV and Beavis and Butthead. And when they were one of their songs was taken down out of the show, right? Which is the song Bruised Violet, because it has the line, liar, liar, liar. And of course, the two characters on TV that we saw when, you know, if you're someone like me, when you were like 12, they were saying fire, fire. So that's kind of a throwback, and it's cool to listen to that kind of music. Now that you know, that sort of punk, 90s punk, girl punk music, you know, obviously is influenced by Sylvia Plath, but we're going to see that Sylvia Plath is a rich rich poet to read. Her poems are striking. They are violent. The language is strong. So if you love literature, or if you just like, words, you want to talk about some deep analysis, some occult imagery, and some symbolism, I think you might like this stream. I'm kind of excited for this one. And that may seem, if you're watching this, like an aberration. We've been doing a lot of classic literature. This is classic literature. This is for the mid 20th century. And I guess I could start off by telling you about like my own, what I think about Sylvia Plath. But actually, before I do that, why don't we? Yes, and shout out, by the way, shout out to Rachel Wilson, based homeschool mom, our resident e-celeb, our resident TV celeb. You may know her from Exposing Powerful Lies live streams, and of course from the T. Carlson interview that she did recently. But she also wrote a great article about Sylvia Plath. And if somebody I couldn't link it so in time. So if one of my beautiful, stunning, and brave mods would look for the Sylvia Plath article by Rachel Wilson, based mom, and maybe link that in the chat, that would be great. It's a great thing to read. So shout out to you. I appreciate your work, and everybody should check her out. So why don't we begin by just looking at some books here. Now I have a few. You may be surprised, but I have a few books relating to Sylvia Plath. So let's get into it. And by the way, I hope everybody's doing well. It's a nice March, dark, overcast, rainy day, at least where I am here in the wastelands. And shout out to Natesky driving out there, rocking that Suzuki Samurai, and hopefully I can get some bass wave in here so you can blast it when the stream starts. Shout out to you, homie. Appreciate you. So yeah, this is the perfect weather for me here in the acid rain wastelands for Sylvia Plath, because we're going to see some of this dark material here. So let's look at some Sylvia Plath books. We'll start with her famous book, ARIEL. This is her best and most well-known book of poems. And this is I don't want to say newer copy, because the date that I read this is November 1999. That's the date that I've read this book many, many times. And this was you can still see it's in, I haven't even bent the spine. I keep this one. This one's always been an important book to me. So that's that one. We're going to compare that to some of her earlier poems, especially pre and early Ted Hughes in her own history, and with her book Crossing the Water. If the stream freezes a little bit, please forgive me and keep going. It's just the signal here is going in and out, but we should be good. So we've got Crossing the Water by Sylvia Plath. This is one of her first books, and in her book Colossus, and we're going to see that there's a marked difference between her later poems and her earlier poems. This is a book called The Savage God by A. Alvarez. And this is an important book because it's about the suicide of I don't want to get that ding, okay? But thank you, Jerry. Appreciate it for linking that article to Rachel. And this is an important book when discussing the life of Sylvia Plath. A. Alvarez was known to her. Is an academic, and he knew her personally. And so that's a study of that. We get the journals of Sylvia Plath here. It's a nice paperback. And this is sort of ties into the bell jar. And it's interesting with this, my books, every time I look for a specific book, I can't find it. I've got a pretty good library here, but I can't find my copy of the bell jar, and I can't find the facsimile copy of ARIEL. But this is a good add-on to the bell jar, especially if you were a riot girl chick in the 90s. You probably checked this book out. Of course, I'm a dude. I'm a regular dude. But I have read a lot of Sylvia Plath. We'll get into that in a little bit, but this is a good book, and it's pretty revelatory in terms of her life. Rachel writes about that in her article. This is a biography of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes that I have called The Silent Woman, which is pretty interesting. I read this one I got this, I think this is a used copy I got in 2016. This is a book, one of the sort of definitive, but I think this is the one that I can't remember if this is the one that was later kind of panned as including a lot of inaccurate material about Sylvia Plath. And but it's called The Haunting of Sylvia Plath. I think this is the one. This might not be that book. That might be, I can't remember, because there's a bunch of biographies about her. One's called Magic Hour and Rough Magic, and I got that here. I'll show you that in a second. So we'll go into that. This stack of books is pretty tall. It's casting a shadow on me right now. I've got this pocket edition. This pocket. Is this a Faber edition? Let's see. Yeah, this is a pocket Faber paperback edition of Sylvia Plath, edited by Ted Hughes. And I got this when I was at university in Belfast, and at the Queen's bookstore, Queen's University bookstore. Shout out to Queen's University. And I got this and a bunch of other. This was a new series that they did in the early 2000s, where they did sort of a series of selected poems selected by other poets. And it was interesting that, they did this edition because, well, let's see when this was published. This was published in, this particular one was published in 85. That's the year that Ted Hughes became the poet laureate of England. But I remember in the late 90s when Birthday Letters came out. Birthday Letters is a book of poems that Ted Hughes wrote specifically about Sylvia Plath, which was pretty controversial but well received, and it's a good book of poems. We're not going to really discuss that so much today. Here's another Faber copy, the same book. I got this one, Belfast 2005, when I was in graduate school there at the Seamus Heaney School for Poetry, when I met old Seamus, and it's just another edition of that one. This is a biography of Ted Hughes by Lane Feinstein that I enjoyed. It's just a pretty straight biography. I've got the Faber new and selected poems of Ted Hughes here. And this is the copy that I usually go to when I'm going to read Ted Hughes because it's pretty comprehensive. Got a good selection of his poems. So let's just some of them right there. Let's get to this other stack here. I'm not going to show you all my Ted Hughes books because, yes, shout out to Mixkey. Yeah. Yes, Kang, get yourself some McDee's right now. Get yourself a number one Big Mac ski meal, Macho Mick, and sit back, chill, and relax and listen to some literature. Listen to me drone and babble on about some literature. But anyway, I've got a big library of Ted Hughes poems. And interestingly, my cousin went to he was getting his PhD at Emory University in Atlanta, and they have one of the major Ted Hughes libraries at that at the university. He owned a bookstore later, and he's given me a lot of these books. But this is, I've got a good selection myself. I've got all of his books of poems, but we're not going to go over all Ted Hughes, just Sylvia Plath, because she only has 3 books, and even though I've got a bunch of stuff about her. But this is a good one if you're interested. Ted Hughes wrote a lot. He was prolific. And this one is called Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being. And it's Ted Hughes' writing on Shakespeare. This is actually a Barnes & Noble copy of the book that I picked out. But, book's a book. So that's a great book if you're interested in Shakespeare, and kind of a different take on Shakespeare, especially coming from Ted Hughes, who we'll see is much more interested in the, bringing out the darker and a lot of times more esoteric elements of Shakespeare, and certainly in his own poems. This is one of my favorite books. This is just a book, 8 American Poets. Got John Berryman, Theodore Rothke. It's got some Allen Ginsberg in here, Anne Sexton, and Sylvia Plath. And we could go into Anne Sexton later because her own life involves MK Ultra. But we'll kind of dive into that with Sylvia Plath a little bit. But I had this copy this book right here that I got. I took one of my final classes at university was on modern American poets. So this one's well read, and it was around this time actually. I'd liked Sylvia Plath before that, but it was around that time when I really got into Sylvia Plath. I really started to read her pretty heavily. Not, the class brought it out, but I'll tell that story a little bit later. Then I've got this biography by Paul Alexander, Rough Magic, about Sylvia Plath. I've got this book by Erica Wagner, Ariel's Gift, which is about Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath, and the Story of Birthday Letters. This is another Faber edition. I read this one in 2003, so that's an interesting book. Then I've got actually a copy of Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath's daughter, Frida Hughes, who is now an older lady. And she's a poet herself, and this is called 45. So it's a book of Frida Hughes's poems. It's not bad. And we'll get into, she had a brother, Nicholas Hughes, who died I guess now it's probably years ago, but it seems like it was yesterday. But we'll get into their history a little bit as we go. So let's start off by talking about reading some poems from the book ARIEL here. And maybe I'll read it from this book. Let's see. I wrote in the front of this book, The Trope of Vulnerability, Harold Bloom. Okay, I don't remember what that note's about. But we're going to start off by reading Daddy. I still got my notes in here from 22 years ago. So maybe I'll just read it from this because it's a clean copy. Anyway, so yeah, maybe I'll tell the story first of why I got into Sylvia Plath. So I was at university, and I was studying under the poet Maeve McGookian, who's a famous Northern Irish poet. She was kind of a protege of Seamus Heaney. And I studied under her for undergrad, and then later when I went back for my graduate degree. And she's known as, one of the most famous Northern Irish poets, especially one of the most famous female Northern Irish poets. And later I was studying under this professor, Michael Allen, R.I.P., and Edna Longley, who's also a big-time academic, whose husband is a famous Northern Irish poet, Michael Longley. They were friends with Seamus Heaney. She would tell stories about how when Dylan Thomas was alive, before he died in 1953, when she was in Belfast, he would come and visit and do readings and such. And she was alive for when she actually witnessed Dylan Thomas being beaten by his wife, Caitlin, because they had a notorious tempestuous Welsh relationship. And one time she was walking out of the pub, and she saw Dylan Thomas being walloped by her notoriously violent and I guess you could say mentally ill, verifiably wife, Caitlin. I've got her autobiography back there, Caitlin. Bunch of books on Dylan Thomas. But anyway, I was at university, and I met this girl. Named Zara, right? Spelled, like a czar, like a female czar. And this girl, I don't know. I probably shouldn't tell these stories, but I'll tell it anyway because it's kind of fun. This girl was really cool. She was like I'd never met anybody like this before. Like, she was brilliant. She was incredibly intuitive and intelligent and witty in class. She wrote kind of wild poems, like, because we were in a creative writing class that I'd never seen before. And so we got to talking, and then one day, after class, we went to the pub. We went to the parlor. Shout out to Crispy. We went to the parlor, and then later we went back to her house, her flat in a house in a place called the Holy Lands in Belfast near the university. And anyway, we went to her house, and this girl was like the poet. She was like the definition of what later I would call, kind of a Plathian poet. She just kind of seemed like dark. She had this cool hair. It's like dark hair. and she like wore kind of like bohemian clothes, and she like rolled her own cigarettes and all this stuff, which was not unusual at the time for anybody then. Um, it was really cool. And then we went back to her house, and like we were in this like dingy, student flat in this house, and the house was the former house of Anthony Trollope, the writer, and it was like the definition of like a romantic era decaying grand mansion, and it had these old red carpets, and she like lit these candles, and then we were sitting there talking. This is, we were students at university, so this is how intellectual we were. And she asked me, if I'd read Sylvia Plath, and like, and I said yes, and we started talking about Sylvia Plath, but I wasn't like, I just kind of read her. I read Plath like kind of, I guess, like anyone interested in literature would read, but I didn't take an immediate interest. I'd always had my own, favorite poets, and then she said, have you ever read Ted Hughes? And then she brought out this old, dog-eared copy of Ted Hughes. And I remember, like looking at Ted Hughes's poems, and I was just like, it was like an epiphany. It was crazy. This was a great night, by the way. There was a lot going on. It wasn't just this, but anyway. And I remember reading Ted Hughes and being blown away. And it was like, I'd never read, other than Rimbaud, I'd never read poetry that was this dark and this strong before. It was just violent, and the words are they just immediately struck me. And anyway, so that's where I'll end that story. But anyway, let's get into that's anyway. The point of the story was that's when I got back into really strongly Sylvia Plath, and I really started to read her pretty heavily. And then because the Ted Hughes reading Ted Hughes then made me reopen my eyes to Sylvia Plath and the power and the potency of her poems. So I'm going to read she's got, this book is amazing. We're going to start off by just looking at, I would like to read the actual poem ARIEL, but I can't read it on here because for a number of reasons, because the language in it is, I know we're just reading poems, but believe it or not, we can't read it here because there's some of the words in the poem will definitely get us in trouble. So that sucks. Maybe when I get my rock fan up, or, if I get a Patreon or something, then I can read it there. But I'm very hesitant to read it, especially on camera, or just read it aloud at all. This poem is also, there's a lot in this poem. And I'm going to read it anyway, even though it will contain some loaded terms, because I think, we've got to be able to read this stuff. We're talking about important and, literature. So we've got to be able to read it and to look at the actual words. And I'm not going to censor it at all because, right, as we said before, and as Ezra Pound said, better mendacities than the classics in paraphrase. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to read it. This is called Daddy. This is probably her most famous poem, Sylvia Plath. It's quite a long poem. It's in this book, it's about, 3.5 pages, but it is a lyric poem. It's not a narrative poem. And we're going to read the whole thing without stopping. So tell me at the end what you think of it. And then we'll go back and we'll do some analysis. Okay. But it will become evident to you what this poem is about. So it's called Daddy by Sylvia Plath. You do not do any more black shoe, in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or chew. Daddy, I've had to kill you. You died before I had time. Marble heavy, a bag full of God. Ghastly statue with one gray toe, big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic, where it pours bean green over blue. In the waters off beautiful Nauset, I used to pray to recover you. Ach, du. In the German tongue, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars. But the name of the town is common. My Polak friend says there are a dozen or two, so I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It's stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ich. I could barely speak. I thought every German was you in the language obscene, an engine chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck and my tarot pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. I've always been scared of you with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, and your neat mustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue, Panzer Man. Oh, you, not God, but a swastika, so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist. The boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot. But no less a devil for that. No, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do. But they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, 7 years, if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back down now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, you bastard. I'm through. Whew. Wow. Okay. So, yeah, this is Sylvia Plath, the poem Daddy. Now, listening to this, you guys, what do you think? What do you think the implications are for literature, for specific movements, especially political or socio-political movements that happened in the 20th century and that go to even now? What do you think the implications are of this, right? This is like the poem almost reads like a mantra, right? It reads like a obviously not an instruction manual, but it's very strong. Yes. It's shocking. You can't help but listen to this and be shocked. It's shocking literature. For one, let's talk about the poem itself and the construction of the poem. The whole poem is an ooh, right? It has an ooh rhyme to it. Yes. Now, why is that? Why do you guys think that is? Well, if you're watching this, you may think, this may be obvious to you, right? That's all right, Rachel. We see you. Thank you. I'm so glad you're here. Shout out to Rachel Wilson, because now we're just getting into the poem Daddy, and you are the expert in this. I hope to speak to you soon. Maybe we can do an interview, etc. That would be great, because you are the expert in this sphere. We're just looking at this poem from the literary perspective, talking about the words on the page, and we're going to talk about the implications and the worldview expressed, and what is her purpose? What is the speaker's purpose in this poem? So again, like we've said many times now, when we are discussing the literature, we're not going to discuss it in terms of Sylvia Plath says this. Okay, we're saying the speaker says this. Now, obviously, this is highly autobiographical. In fact, the poem itself, Sylvia Plath studied under Robert Lowell, and their sphere of poets in the mid-20th century, this is post-World War II, early 50s into the 60s, is referred to, it's called confessional poetry. Now, that's just a subgenre, a branch of modern lyric poems, but it came about because of the general malaise, right? The NUI of the post World War II era, especially in America. And we'll see that there is a lot to be read into. I mean, Sylvia Plath talks about this specifically, but Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, two of the famous, women, they're referred to as feminist poets. But with Sylvia Plath, we're going to see that's kind of a deceptive term. Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, both of whom I'll go over a little bit of their biography in a minute, except for the fact that they certainly were at psychiatric institutions. They certainly were subjected to electroshock therapy. And I mean, is this MK Ultra, right? With Anne Sexton, it explicitly is. But so other poets, Robert Lowell, Theodore Rothke, John Berryman, are called confessional poets because their poems are highly autobiographical. The language is strong and direct. They mean exactly what they say. And there's something else going on here, which I was alluding to a second ago with the form of Daddy. And that is the fact that the speaker is referring to Daddy, right? Calling Daddy by this childlike name. That's purposeful because that ties into the form of the poem. The entire poem has this ooh rhyme because it is like a nursery rhyme. The poem is supposed to it's supposed to sound like a nursery rhyme. And that gives us this sort of contrast between the innocence of the sound of the poem and the way that the poem looks on the page, right? And the words, the specific diction in the page. What does this mean? I mean, when I think the ooh sound, I think, what did Sam Hyde and Nick say about all the tech names of everything? Now, everything's infantilized, right? Everything's an ooh sound, right? YouTube, Google Gaga, right? Google, right? Hulu. Everything is this kind of baby sound. And she does that purposefully. Yes, because she's trying to say that the actual experience is different from the surface reality. So let's get into the poem here. She says, notice there's a lot of repetition in this poem because it's meant to sound like the repetition of a nursery rhyme or a song. You do not do any more black shoe. This reminds me of the old woman who lived in a shoe, right? In which I've lived like a foot. So right off the bat, she's saying she, the speaker, has lived like a foot or like a heel, right? She feels low. For 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or eschew. The word eschew there is brilliant because Sylvia Plath really makes use of onomatopoeia in such a strong way. There's no other word that could express there number one, the innocence of the speaker referring back to their childhood. And she's doing what James Joyce really pioneered in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man obviously begins with the speaker talking about he does something inventive here. Instead of the usual a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or discussing from the point of view of the speaker, like what childhood was like in the words of an adult. Well, Joyce decides to instead talk about the moo cow. So if you're going to give a narrative of what life was like as a small child, then it makes sense that the form and the content would match, and you would use the diction of a small child, the moo cow. And that's what she does here with a chew, right? TGF, Green Feather, says her dad died from foot cancer, right? And yes, Rachel says she looked into Plath's dad a lot. We're going to talk about Plath's dad, Otto, in a second here. She says, Daddy, I've had to kill you, second stanza. She's had to kill him. You died before I had time. Well, there you go. There's part of the trauma, right? Plath's I hate to mix the words in the poem with Plath's own biography, but I guess it may help, and it may be revelatory just if you're watching this or you've never heard of Plath, just to talk about her life and how it plays into her poems. And also that's fair because we're talking about confessional poetry here, right? But yes, Sylvia Plath's father died. Her mother's named Aurelia Plath, and her father died. He was a schoolmaster He died, and he was a beekeeper and a schoolmaster, and he died when she was very young. So she felt abandoned by her father. Now, I think there's more going on there, a lot more, because that's not just where the trauma comes from. But she says she hates her dad, right? She hates him because he abandoned her in death. Marble heavy, a bag full of God. Ghastly statue with one gray toe big as a Frisco seal, right? So in other words, he's as big as a continent. Yes. And to her, in her mind, her dad is this godlike figure, right? But he has abandoned her. Now, this is Plath's words. Okay. Obviously we're getting into the darkness of her own vision, and this is not what we believe. Yes. But this is what Plath says. She says, ahead in the freakish Atlantic where it pours bean green over blue. So she finishes the third stanza talking about Massachusetts. She's from Massachusetts. And it's almost like he's big as a continent. His head's in the Atlantic, his toes in the Pacific. Ah, do, she begins. She's the word achu is a foreshadowing of the later Germanic diction that we get throughout the poem. And the reason for that is because her dad was Austrian. And he was a big old Austrian schoolmaster dude who was a beekeeper and had this thick mustache. And, you know, you can see photos of him. He's a commanding presence, obviously, in her diaries, which we talked about. Rachel, we talked about some of her diaries. We talked about the journals of Sylvia Plath. We talked about, I'm not going to go back through them all again right now. We talked about A. Alvarez book, Savage God. We talked about Rough Magic and The Haunting of Sylvia Plath, The Silent Woman by Janet Malcolm, etc. But yeah, she was haunted by this figure of her father, who also, because of the time, plays into a sort of a Hitlerian idea of an autocrat, right? And that affects her. She says, in the German tongue, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars. Plath often will repeat words and phrases, not only throughout the poem, but in sequence. And she does that because it is emphasizing the fact that the war is continuous in her own life. She's at war with herself, with her own mind, with her psyche, and with her past, and with the ghost of her father. Scraped flat by the roller, right? But the name of the town is common. She says, there are a dozen or two, so I can never tell where you put your foot, your root. There's this constant idea of the foot and the root. And again, shout out to TGF for mentioning that. This is the root is the, pardon the pun, source of the cancer. And I would say the what she would feel is the spiritual cancer rotting her own worldview, right? Yes, thank you, TGF. Hold on, let me go back. Where'd I go? Oh, how did I get to that? Nope. Go back to the comments. Okay. TGF says the triple invocative she does is a biblical reference. Thank you. Yeah. Whenever high IQ, green feathers, whenever in poems we get, there are a couple of words and phrases and poetic techniques that will automatically make us go to a biblical reference, right? Will automatically make us think of the biblical diction. And one is the repetition of words or phrases in sequence. Will oftentimes do that. Another is the word and. Remember, we got in Macbeth the sequence of Macbeth looking at Banquo and his ancestors stretching out to the crack of doom. Thou shalt get kings, beget, right? And the word and will often do that, especially in Walt Whitman. And long stanzas, rolling stanzas that are almost scroll-like, right? Which will indicate like the long passage of familial time. She says, I could never talk to you and the tongue stuck in my jaw. It's interesting that phrase, the tongue stuck in my jaw, occurs right after my own tongue stuck in my jaw reading this. I got tripped up while I was reading it, but that's exactly what happens to her. She says it's stuck in a barbed wire snare. Now we're getting specific war imagery. The foot caught in the snare, the mouth, right? It's almost like this is almost like a hoofed mouth or a trench mouth. Ich, right? She repeats, I can't speak. The German language, I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you in the language obscene. Well, the language is obscene to the speaker here because the Germanic tongue is hard, violent, tactile to our English ears, which of course is interesting because English is a Germanic language, essentially a Germanic language, right? English, we'll have to go back to Beowulf and the Seafarer and the Wanderer, but English is a Germanic language, right? Anglo-Saxon, a Viking Germanic language, which is still similar in terms of cognates, and our word roots come from essentially from Germanic, of course, then Latin and Greek. But what she's saying here is that she's expressing what we all sort of know. You know, you hear the German language and you automatically think violence because we associate it with the war. But you could say the same for many languages, even in the English language, and the difference between, let's say, Northern Irish and the Republic of Ireland, right? Or in America with the sort of New York minute talking versus the Southern drawl. Oftentimes, colder climates will affect language by making the language more clipped and violent and to the point and strict to get out of the cold weather. Whereas in Southern climes, it will often be drawn out and euphonous, right? She says here, she obviously brings in the engines, and I'm not going to read that part again, but in this stanza, but she mentions the specific tration camps, and she repeats the specific word where she says she feels like a JEW, right? Because she feels that speaker here is oppressed, singled out, and trampled upon. She says she takes a break here in this next stanza. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna, right? Because he was Austrian, are not very pure or true. Interesting. This is Rachel's territory right here. She would know more about this. She says, with my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck and my tarot pack, right? And this always made me think of that girl Zara I had talked about before, who was certainly into all this, but also the tarot pack, and the later on Sylvia Plath, when she was writing ARIEL, took on this person. She changed her whole appearance and she put her hair in braids, and she would often comment that she was trying to look like a Germanic gypsy woman. And the tarot pack, even more so in this poem, the tarot pack is spelled, it's an archaic spelling for tarot pack. So we get the sense of ancient, of the antique, right? That her history has been destined for her. She says that she's always been scared of you, she italicizes. This is so brilliant, the way she says this here. I've always been scared of you with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygook, and your neat mustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue. Panzerman. Oh, you. I mean, that stanza is incredibly violent, right? The speaker here is in absolute agony and pain. And her pain is interesting the way she expresses it, because the words become gobbledygook, right? With your Luftwaffe. She doesn't mean it literally, yes. Her father was not in the Luftwaffe that I know of. Maybe he was, but I don't think so. But because they'd already moved to America. But she associates, right, this Waffen, this air force falling in over her from above. It towers over her, and it's sort of dominating. It's a dominating presence in her life, so much that the words get stuck in her mouth and she's just speaking nonsense in terms of any Germanic language she can, right? The mustache is obviously a Hitlerian reference. The Aryan eye, bright blue, brings us back to the the bean green over blue of his head in the Atlantic. He had a bright blue eye, a Hitlerian eye. She says, not God, but a swastika so black no sky could squeak through. So all she sees is this makes me think of that propaganda poster of the German soldier stamping on Europe, right? With the particular symbol on the bottom of the boot. And later on, remember, she says at the end, every woman adores a fascist, the brute heart of a brute like you, the boot in the face, right? And did I freeze? Hopefully I will get back. Hopefully I'm still going. Am I still going, guys? Yes. Okay, good. Sorry, I redlined there for a second. Okay. So, and we think of this dominating, sky wheel, this sun wheel, this swastika over her. No sky could squeak through. Later she says, you stand at the blackboard deck. The poem keeps going back into her history, right? It's talking about now, started off with childhood, and we get sort of a few different perspectives here. We get the perspective of her now looking back, her looking back, then looking forward. We get the perspective of what her life would be like looking forward, but from the perspective of now in the speaker's current day. No less a devil for that. The cleft chin, obviously the cleft foot, right? She says he's a black man, a blackish soul, right? And this makes me think of the Emerson. Was it the Emerson? No, it's Washington Irving story, The Devil and Tom Walker, where the devil is referred to as Old Nick, right? Old Scratch. And he is seen as black. His skin is black from the soot of toiling in hell. And of course, that sort of fits in with Sylvia Plath, being that she was from Massachusetts, right? From the New England territory. We've talked about the New England poets. That they pulled me out of, she says, at 20, I tried to die, right? He bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. She was 10 when he died. At 20, she tried to die. Yes. We'll see in Lady Lazarus that she tried to do something to her. She tried to kill herself twice, which she often will mention in her poems, 10 and then 20, and then later succeeds. Yes, if you don't know this, Sylvia Plath's death is notorious. She was living in her. What happened was she split up from Ted Hughes. She was convinced that he was cheating on her. And who knows if he was. In the biographies, all the biographies I've read of Ted Hughes, and Sylvia Plath, it sort of indicates that he wasn't, but her jealousy drove him to it. But who knows? Maybe he was, right? But in any case, they split up. She moved with the children, Nicholas and Frida, to London, and they actually lived in a flat, the top floor of a flat, which was once occupied by William Butler Yeats. And it was in a period of about 6 months in the very last year of her life where she had a prolific spell of writing furiously. She wrote the best poems of her life. She wrote all of the last poems of ARIEL, sometimes 2 a day. And you can read, where the book ARIEL drops off is where her life literally drops off. And there's a particular poem, Edge, that we can get to, which is not, I don't think that's her last poem, but to me, it's her last poem. And then what she did was the children were asleep, Nicholas and Frida, and she went into their bedroom. It was cold. It was an unusually cold winter that year. And she would often go down and talk to her downstairs neighbor about the fact that she was having a nervous breakdown. She didn't think she was going to live. And then she went back upstairs, opened the window, tucked him into bed, shut the door, put a towel down at the bottom of the door, turned on the oven, stuck her head in the oven, and killed herself. And so the window was open so she wouldn't hurt her children. They were fine. But then she was found dead. And it's interesting. I hate to say this, right? But the oven image obviously plays into this poem because we get the NAZI images throughout the poem. And also the fact that it's her head. It's like she's burning away her soul, right? Is what I think we can read into it. Also, interesting that she was in psychotherapy and had electroshock treatments. So they were, her mind was being subjected to literal burning electroshock, and she imitates that with her final act. Later on, tragically, what happens is Ted Hughes, her husband, marries Asha Weevil, an Israeli poetess, who then does the same to herself with her child. Then years later, Nicholas Hughes grows up to be I think he was an anthropologist, or he was a naturalist at a university in America. And I remember the day that I found out that he also had done this. So their life was marred with obviously deeply disturbing and dark things, but we can obviously point in some of the source material and in some of her own writing that this may have had to do, I would say it did have to do with their mutual interest in the occult, witchcraft, tarot, and Ouija boards. They would often, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes would often do a Ouija board together, and they contacted a spirit named Pan. And Sylvia Plath tells, I remember, I don't know if I can find it. I certainly can't right now, but I remember reading this about 22 years ago, that one day they were sitting on a hillside by the river, looking at the river. They might've been in Cambridge, but they were looking at the river and they were having a good time, having a picnic, just the two of them, a lover's picnic. And all of a sudden, Ted Hughes turned to her and had his eyes were black. He had the black goo eyes. The From Hell film with John Depp, demon eyes, right? And he turned to her and he strangled her. He got on top of her and he started doing that to her to the point where she couldn't breathe. All of a sudden, she thought she was going to die, and then all of a sudden he stopped, turned, sat back up, and then turned back around, and his eyes were clear, and it was like nothing had ever happened. And obviously, this was an incredible example of what would you say? Was this an example of demonic possession? Was this an example of a manifestation of what they had been interested in? She mentions the tarot pack in this poem specifically. Now, this is the speaker in the poem, but she was personally interested in this, right? That combined with her electroshock, we could say, is probably an example of what we would later call, right, MK Ultra, monarch programming, SRA. And I tend to think that a lot of this trauma comes from the fact that not only her dad died, but that something else, which I'm not going to say, happened when she was very young. And certainly she sort of repeats this and looks for this dominating figure like her dad. She says that in Daddy, right? Who she saw in Ted Hughes. And quickly, I'll tell the story of when she met Ted. If you know this, you'll know this well if you know anything about Sylvia Plath. But the first meeting with Ted Hughes, when she met Ted Hughes, she was at Cambridge on a Fulbright scholarship. There's another little element that I'll drop in there. She was at Cambridge on a Fulbright scholarship from Smith College, where she had gone. She had been writing for Cosmopolitan and women's magazines. She'd been writing, short stories, and she was really interested in being a typical 50s woman, right? She wanted to be a homemaker. She wanted to find a husband. Later on, she had an obsession with baking and with sort of trying to fit into the conventional mold of a family, which of course she didn't have because her father was gone. That also ties into her death, right? Because of her mode of death ties into the idea of her constantly baking. Ted Hughes, she always said when she couldn't write and Ted was outside and he would come back with all these poems, and she hadn't written a thing, but she'd baked like a bunch of pies, and she always felt like that he looked at her like she was insane because of, this sort of obsessive behavior. But so what happened was that when she went to Cambridge, she was at a party and she looked across the room. It was like the literati was there, the young elite literati. Ted Hughes is from Yorkshire. He's not. We wouldn't say that he's elite born and bred. Maybe he was. I can't speak to that right now. But he was from Yorkshire. He was a Northern Englishman. And what's up, bud? And so, but he was a known poet. He was kind of not a star, but he was a known figure who was already writing. I think he'd already published The Hawk and the Rain, his first book of poems. But anyway, she didn't know that. And she looked across the room and saw this tall, dark, Heathcliff Byronic, again, go back and look at the Byron streams, figure across the room. And what she did was she walked right up to him. She was immediately drawn to him, magnetized to him. She walked right up to him, introduced herself, and bit him on the cheek. And she bit him so hard that she drew blood, right? This sort of unconscious, ritualistic blood drawing behavior is interesting because she drew blood on his face, and blood was streaming down his face. And his reaction was that he did not dislike it. And later on, I think she left. And then later on that night, she went back to her student flat, and she heard rocks at the window, and Ted Hughes came back and he was throwing rocks at the window, and he tried to, he wanted to go out with her. And then later they ended up dating, and then they got married, and then they moved to America. And, you could read a lot into that, right? The fact that, he was willing to abandon his home to come back to America, where he continued to write prolifically. He had no problem with the change of scenery. And that sort of played into her. I don't know if it played into her jealousy, but it played into her sense of worthlessness, that even back home where she thought she could write, she wasn't writing. And she was writing poems. She was sort of churning them out, but they were mediocre. They weren't getting a good, yes, it was absolutely vampiric. Green Feathers. Thank you. And we'll see later on that Ted Hughes's own poems played a huge role in the transformation of herself as a poet, because she goes from being a sort of cookie cutter, which is, I guess, a pun, right? Because of what she was interested in at the time, cookie cutter poet, to experiencing and getting in touch with her own trauma through the language of Ted Hughes, and using his language to inform her own voice. She found her own voice as a poet, which was this expression of all of this darkness. And unfortunately, it ended the way that it did, right? She was in her early 30s. Where she lived from 1931 to 1963, I think. Died in 1963. I think she was 32 when she died. But, later on, posthumously, her poems and her books, especially The Bell Jar, have become so well known and so famous. And it's interesting that, Ted Hughes's own gravestone is desecrated every year in the name of his destruction of Sylvia Plath and his feminism, and that may be true in terms of their relationship and what they did, although they were both involved in this stuff. But it is Ted Hughes who published her poems and used his own connections with Faber and with T.S. Eliot, etc., to get her published and to become a star. Now, the problem is that he also would never let anyone see her original manuscripts, and he would never publish her own diaries. And we can only guess why, right? But then later on, Ted Hughes tries to sort of bookend that with the birthday letters. So anyway, we'll just finish this poem up here, right? She goes into the specific vampiric imagery here. I mean, this is explicitly vampirical, right? There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through. So pretty rough material there. Let's look at that compared to a poem from Crossing the Water by Sylvia Plath, which is much different. I'm just going to read you. Let's see which one I should read you. There are a couple of really good poems in here. They're not the great ones. But you can see towards the end of this book with Witch Burning, with let's see, with Wuthering Heights is not a bad poem, which obviously plays into her sort of mythical love, right? Her sense of mythos associated with her husband, Ted Hughes, because he's from Yorkshire, right? Where Wuthering Heights takes place in Northern England, or does it take place in Northumbria? Forgive me if you're watching this. And let's see. And with her poem, let's see. Why don't we read Blackberrying? Because we can see a difference here. First of all, you'll notice just right off the bat, remember poetry is not like prose in a number of ways. First of all, poetry is the synthesis. It's language distilled to its essence, right? That's why we have poems. It's higher than prose. When we read a novel, it's meant to be read on the page. It's thrown onto the page in paragraphs. We have poems in stanzas, and one of the reasons I had a particular problem with Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize, not like the Nobel Prize is indicative of anything great anymore, right? Or was, right? It's a total Globus operation, folks. We'll call it Globus here. But one of the reasons I had a problem with Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize for Literature was that Bob Dylan's poems are not meant to be read on the page. They're meant to be heard. So we cut out automatically. Now, they gave it to him, obviously, because of his influence on, modern culture and on rock and sort of introducing a literary element into music. And he's old. But it is completely different than, let's say, Seamus Heaney winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995, which is the difference is the fact that the Heaney poems are meant to be read on the page and heard aloud, and that the poems are a complete and pure picture of one's experience especially in Northern Ireland, or original Northern Irish voice put onto the world stage. If you haven't read Seamus Heaney's Beowulf, that's one of the books that made me decide to leave school in America and go to Belfast. That was like my final thing that said, I got to go. So I left school early and then went off to university in Belfast. I left my first year. Well, I didn't leave early. I mean, I left after my first year and then went off to Belfast. Anyway, but we can see right away that Sylvia Plath's poems are so different from her earlier poems. So, for instance, we look at just randomly, this is what her poems look like. I'm trying not to bend the spine on this book, and I don't have any marks in it. Remember, this is my favorite copy. So this is what her poems look like in her latter days, right? You notice how they are shorter lyric poems and they are spare. The language is spare. She cuts, right? She makes a lot of cuts and gets down to the essence of language. Whereas this poem right here, look at this. It goes on, and it's almost like prose poems. This is this poem, The Babysitters. It's just long. It's too many words, and she knew that. But let's read some of this poem, Blackberrying by Sylvia Plath, just to see the difference. Nobody in the lane and nothing but blackberries. Blackberries on either side, though on the right mainly, a blackberry alley going down in hooks and a sea somewhere at the end of it, heaving. Blackberries big as the ball of my thumb and dumb as eyes. Ebon in the hedges, fat with blue-red juices. These they squander on my fingers. I had not asked for such a blood sisterhood. They must love me. They accommodate themselves into my milk bottle, flattening their sides. Now, it's a well-known poem. Actually, this poem, when I took the AP exam, the English literature AP exam back in the 90s, this is one of the poems that was included. They had an Evan Boland poem, Irish poet. There was a Seamus Heaney excerpt. There was Blackberrying by Sylvia Plath, and there was Facing It by Yusef Kumunyaka. I was lucky because this is crazy, but the night before the AP exam, I went to see Yusef Kuminyaka do a poetry reading in town, and it was another huge. It was so awesome. It was like one of those life milestones for me. But the most famous poem that he read is called "Facing It," about the Vietnam War Memorial, and we can go over that in a later stream. But the next day, I took the AP exam, and the final question was on the poem "Facing It" by Yusef Kuminyaka. So, bam, I dominated the exam. I got a perfect score on my AP exam. I dominated it. I'm not bragging, folks. That's just what happened. But this poem, though, gave me a lot of, well, I don't want to say gave me a lot of trouble, but it annoyed me. And it still annoys me because but we can see, and she discusses this in her own autobiography, that there are too many words. She's trying. See, you can see the speaker in this looking for material. They're looking for content. They need something to write about, right? She needs something to write about. And so she's at home. She's putting blackberries into a bottle. She's a mother. And we get a couple of the later esoteric elements right here, right? I had not asked for such a blood sisterhood, which is obviously a coven image, right? And we get this idea of blood. Later on, she discusses going down in hooks. The idea of the hook is something that really, really is an image that recurs later in ARIEL, and that I always wondered what she means here, because she always talks about dark hooks, and I didn't get it. I think recently I was talking to ADH, shout out ADH, Devotional Heart, and I forget what it was we were listening to her reading, or I just read, and it had something about hooks in it. But it made perfect sense, because she's not only talking about like the hook in terms of writing, which is a term that annoys me. When one is writing, they will often say, it's got to have a hook. That always annoys me. Kind of like the word flow when you're discussing your own writing, or you're discussing the continuity inherent, a rhythm inherent in especially a piece of lyric poetry. It's not a flow. It's a continuity. It's a rhythm. Flow that's fine if you want to use flow, but I would avoid that. I personally avoid that word. I never use that word, because it's sort of, to me, it's kind of a elementary term for poetry. It's something that somebody says to you when you're like in ninth grade trying to learn how to write an essay. That you need a hook and you need flow, and those are sort of abstract terms that don't really mean anything. So anyway, so I'm not going to read any more of that poem because it annoys me, but it does have overhead go the chuffs in black cacophonous flocks. Okay, so that line, for example, the first line in the second stanza, we could say what she's going to do is she's going to realize that none of that needs to be there. She can just say either the cacophonous flocks or the chuffs cacophonous flocks, and we can read the rest. This is what Hemingway did, right, with ellipsis. Ezra Pound taught Hemingway that you don't need to tell the reader everything. You just show the images, right? There's a lot to be gleaned from simply reading the words or the images on the page, especially with just verbs and nouns. All you need in a sentence to make a sentence is a verb and a noun, right? You have 9 parts of speech and you just need a verb and a noun. You need the action, you need the motion, and you need the person, place, thing, or idea that is doing such. In fact, you can even have a sentence with just a verb, right? Go. That's a sentence because it's an understood you. But all of the adjectives and the adverbs and the descriptors and the qualifiers, they can be taken out. They're unnecessary. And a lot of times it's what's not being said that's important and that's significant instead of what is being said in the poem. From there, let's move on to, we could go into Lady Lazarus, her other famous poem. But before we do that, I think we'll go into, I really wish I could read ARIEL, but I can't read it here. But we're going to read the poem Cut. And what do you think this poem is about? Well, she tells us. It's interesting, though, that Sylvia Plath is really a master of titles. So one thing about modern art, shout out to Jay's analysis and his stream on Modern Art is Dumb, which is a great stream. And one of the things that is annoying about modern art, especially, visual art, is that you'll often see art pieces titled untitled. which, okay, that's cool in like 1954 if it's the first time, but it's completely unnecessary and dumb now. Put a title on your work. If you're reading a poem and it's titled Untitled, do you see the contradiction there? What is the point? The title is a line of the poem. And Sylvia Plath is a master of this. She does great titles. In fact, this title Cut is we not only know what the poem is going to be about, right? Which is going to be a violent, self-harming image, either purposeful or not on purpose. But it's, oh, thank you, Jeff, by the way, for you like my hat here. And by the way, it's actually not a John Deere hat. That's a little jackalope I got out there. A little jackalope. So anyway, the poem's title is also a verb. It's a command, right? Cut. And is this reflexive? She says, cut. The first line. What a thrill. Uh-oh. It is thrilling, though, in the sense that it is thrilling to read someone who takes a chance, right? Who takes a leap into writing something that is going to be a normal situation, but writes about it in an evocative way, and one that we can relate to, as we'll see. What a thrill, my thumb instead of an onion. The top quite gone, except for a sort of a hinge. You can feel it. You can feel that, right? Everybody in here has probably done that. You're cutting. Well, I myself be going to McDee's, but they be cutting up the onions, or someone does in a pod somewhere. But listen, you're cutting up the food, and bam, you cut right into that thumb by accident, right? And it is a thrill, not a positive thrill, but it is, your blood is literally pumping, right? It's obvious. The fact she compares her thumb to the onion means that she's cutting the onion, but also we get this idea of the famous onion image is from Ibsen's play Peer Gynt, right? The Norwegian playwright, and that's the first like modern play, and we get the character Peer Gynt on stage, and he unravels. This is an actor trick, by the way. They teach you this at drama school. They say, sometimes actors will have a hard time, especially if they're not comfortable with just having nothing in their hands. They don't know what to do with their hands. They don't want to be doing this all the time. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. They don't want to be doing that all the time, right? Just meaningless hand gestures. So what they'll do is they'll peel. I saw Ian McKellen do this on stage in not Uncle Vanya, but a Chekhov play in London. I saw McKellen do this on stage where he was peeling an apple. It's a kind of a, I don't know if it's an inside technique for actors, but on the one hand, you've got something in your hands. On the other hand, you are doing something real and active. And finally, in Peer Gynt, what it does is the onion represents the world, right? So we get the layers of the world, the layers of meaning until we get down to the core. And in the particular speech, right, we can infer that we are talking about unraveling the story, the thread, unraveling meaning until we get to the core. So she's getting to her core here, right? She says, the top quite gone except for a sort of hinge of skin, a flap like a hat, dead white. Then that red plush. Little pilgrim, the Indians axed your scalp. Your turkey waddle carpet rolls straight from the heart. I step on it, clutching my bottle of pink fizz. A celebration this is. Out of a gap, a million soldiers run, redcoats, every one. Whose side are they on? Oh, my homunculus. I am ill. I have taken a pill to kill the thin, papery feeling. Saboteur, kamikaze man. The stain on your gauze, Ku Klux Klan, babushka darkens and tarnishes. And when the bald pulp of your heart confronts its small mill of silence, how you jump, trepanned veteran, dirty girl, thumb stump. So this poem is, you get how it's, again, we get this contrast between the bloody, slice traumatic knife imagery of what she's just done to herself with the thrilling, wonderful, and wondrous feeling of like she's looking at this thing that's just happened to her, and she's thinking like all the metaphors that come out of this. I mean, look at all the metaphors she gets here, right? The homunculus, yes, because it's the stump of her thumb. She says, I'm still going here if the screen cuts out for a second here. She's taking a pill to kill. And notice that this is really where a great poet shows their mastery of language. Because the words, first of all, the way that the poem looks on the page, the stanzas are short stanzas. It's a lyric poem, and we get these like 4-line stanzas because instead of one long stanza, the one long stanza on the page looks like a thumb, right? One long stanza, thumb. We get a constant organism. But when you cut it into particular stanzas, it reflects what she has done, right? She's cut into her thumb. We also get the words themselves mirroring this. The words ill, pill, kill, and thin all have that short I sound, that I, right? And they all have this ILL. When you look at the words, the I, the L, and the L are standing straight up, just like the thumb. She says, this line really reminds me of Daddy because when she said Luftwaffe, right? With your Luftwaffe. Now she says kamikaze man. Why is it a kamikaze man? Because she compares her thumb and the blood, the red coats, everyone, that they're coming out, right? And they are rushing towards death. They're not going to live inside of her body. And so she calls it kamikaze man. Now, I didn't read the words, the stain on your gauze, KUXKLAN. I can't read that here, obviously. It's Sylvia Plath is doing a lot to us, right? Her language is so strong. We can't, the algo and the overlords will not like it, no matter what, if we read her poems here. So that's a shame. But she compares the hooded figures in white, because now her thumb is cut and it has a hinge. So it's like it has a hood, right? She says, again, the word mill, right? There's a lot of L's and I's in this poem. How you jump trepend veteran is brilliant. I didn't understand that for a long time. I remember my friend Gavin in Belfast. I remember he first told me about trepanation. If you don't know, I'm sure you guys know what that is, but if you don't know what it is, this is like an ancient pagan practice of when a person suffered from headaches or whatever, and they would drill a hole in the skull to relieve the pressure. And I think this is tied in with drilling a hole in the skull to exorcise someone, exorcise a particular spirit or demon. But the thumb is trepanned because the head of the thumb has been cut. It's been relieved of the pressure with the blood, right? That third stanza, going back to the third stanza, little pilgrim, the Indian axed your scalp. She compares her thumb to this little Indian, and it's axed your scalp. This is almost like her language here is still giddy and almost childlike, right? Because we remember the ambiance of this poem, which she is great because she never tells us. She simply shows us that she's cutting food, she's making dinner for her family, and the children are probably around, right? But the part that disturbs me the most, I think, is when she said that the carpet rolls, the red carpet, right, rolls straight from the heart. She steps on it, clutching my bottle of pink fizz. She steps on it. She slips on the blood, which to me is just a really disturbing image. I think it's disturbing because not only because now we have blood going from her thumb to the floor, but it's the fact that, it's this degradation, right? It's the fact that the blood is precious for her life and that she's stepping on it. right? And it's obviously it's accidental. She's not doing it on purpose, but it sort of is. It symbolizes the fact that I think of what we could read into what the speaker feels about herself. And maybe that's reading too much. But to me, this is a pretty disgusting image. I mean, think of it in your own life. If you walked into your kitchen and you saw, your wife or your husband or somebody, you walk, even if you walked into a kitchen like in a restaurant and you saw blood on the floor, that's deeply disturbing, right? First of all, you're wondering, where else is the blood? Was it in my Big Mac? But yeah, it's pretty disturbing. So should we go on now to, we could go on now to the poems. Why don't we go on to two of her other shorter poems, Words and Edge? These are, again, spare. These are spare poems. The language is specifically chosen, right? Yes, shout out to everybody here. Thank you for sticking with me and watching this, especially you guys who are here with me now, and especially if you're watching this later. Hopefully this is, you're getting something from the poems, and you don't think I'm just babbling on. And hopefully you're just enjoying this. I can just imagine like myself driving, cross country and trying to find, hours and hours of content just to listen to while I'm driving, where I'm not listening to Bikini Kill, Babes in Toyland, and La Tigra. And so maybe this will keep you going. Yes, thank you, Jerry. I appreciate it. And thank you also, by the way, to everybody who's supported me. I love you and I really appreciate you. And if you're watching this or you're watching this later, don't forget that Cash App link is in the description of the channel, and it's also throughout the chat. Hit me up at Cash App, Bays Lit Analyzer, so I can keep this stuff going. We're gonna keep barreling through. We're gonna get to all sorts of stuff in the future. And also, please make sure you share the stream, put it on. I saw that my streams are being shared on the old Zuckerbot, Faceboom. Thank you to whoever's doing that. I don't have one, but thank you to whoever's doing that. I really appreciate that. Thank you for sharing on Instagram. Catch me on Instagram at Baselit Analyzer. Thank you for sharing on Twitter and just in your community tabs on YouTube, because you guys are, especially my friends who are actual eCeleb streamers. So I really appreciate that. So let's get to two of these poems. These are her last two poems, and they're in sequence. She wrote these right before she died. One is called Words. She says, axes, after whose stroke the wood rings and the echoes traveling off from the center like horses. The sap wells like tears, like the water striving to reestablish its mirror over the rock that drops and turns a white skull eaten by weedy greens. Years later, I encounter them on the road, words dry and riderless, the indefatigable hoof taps, while from the bottom of the pool, fixed stars govern a life. Let's read that last part again. A white skull eaten by weedy greens. Years later, I encounter them on the road, words dry and riderless, the indefatigable hoof taps, while from the bottom of the pool, fixed stars govern her life. Now look, Ted Hughes specifically refers to this in birthday letters, especially fixed stars. Also, we get the constant Diana Godiva imagery. We get that Lady Lazarus, especially. Weird. I'm actually, Lady Godiva is an ancestor of mine, which is weird. The old naked lady that rode a horse through Coventry. Right, she's in one of my ancestors, I do say. We also get the idea of, at the beginning, the axes, which is a pun because it also is axes, right? Like we get an axis around which you spin, and we get, right, so it's at the axes, plural, and we also get axes like chopping, just like in the last poem, bloodshed, right? we get the idea of the fixed stars, which we talked about in a couple of streams. Yes, with Romeo and Juliet, with Julius Caesar, both mentioning the fixed stars, pair of star-crossed. The fault in their stars, right? The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. He tells him. In other words, in Julius Caesar, right? He's saying, look, man, we have free will. It's not fate. We made these decisions. And here is she saying that fate has brought her to this moment, this critical moment in life, this edge, which we're about to read? I think what she's saying is no. It seems like that. It seems like your life is on a trajectory that you can't control, but we know that we have free will. We make decisions. Now, sadly, I think with Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, you could question whether their mental illness and the results of their ABUSE and trauma have taken away agency in their conscious mind, right? However, I think that what she's saying here is no matter what, I've come to this moment, and this is because her ultimate last act of her life is a willed decision. Yes. It is, it's planned and carried out. Sad. But one other thing it's a short poem, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but one other thing I would say about this poem is the idea of the bottom of the pool, fixed stars govern her life is clearly an Odin image, right? This is almost a Nordic mythological image here because, it's weird. Synchro. I was talking about this to somebody today in regards to forget what, but Odin, right? One of the things about in Nordic mythology, what Odin does is, he hangs himself upside down from the world tree. And he falls into the other world, and his eyes, when he is able to see, he sees a pool, and in the pool, at the bottom of the pool, he sees runes, and he gathers up the runes because the runes represent sort of three different things. We'll cover Icelandic literature later, especially Eagle's saga, which goes into this. But the runes represent three things. They represent, the letters of their language. They're able to cast spells, and you're able to see the future, and the sequence of the runes matters, right? Now, I know it's cringe for all of us, but I'm just talking about the way that it is expressed in mythology. And I think that one of the things that Odin has to do, right, is to give his eye in order to take the runes back to humanity in their myth. And obviously this is like a Promethean, like Luciferian image here, right, of giving human beings something. And what she's saying here is that, like, at the bottom of the pool, fixed stars govern her life. She is hanging by a thread in her life. The speaker here looking down into the bottom of her life. The pool would probably signify, it's almost like a labyrinth. It accomplishes the same thing in my opinion that a labyrinth does, right? The archetypal labyrinth, the labyrinthine mind, right? The mind maze, trying to find the center of the maze in order to discover one's true self and psyche. As a result of the mind fracturing, the pool is obviously a water image, which is like a mirror, right? So he's looking into a mirror, looking into himself. And I think that this is what the speaker in this poem is doing, and finding that the future is the past in the speaker's eyes. So let's read her very last poem. This is called Edge. She says, these one-word titles are strong, right? Spare. We get rid of the fluff. She says, Edge. The woman is perfected. Her dead body wears the smile of accomplishment. The illusion of a Greek necessity flows in the scrolls of her toga. Her bare feet seem to be saying, we have come so far, it is over. Each dead child coiled a white serpent, one at each little pitcher of milk, now empty. She has folded them back into your body as petals of a rose, close when the garden stiffens and odors bleed from the sweet, deep throats of the night flower. The moon has nothing to be sad about. Staring from her hood of bone, she is used to this sort of thing. Her blacks crackle and drag. Sad, right? Sad, dark poem. So dark. No one wrote like this, you guys. Right? Yeah, the imagery, good point, TGF. TGF is super based high IQ tonight, you guys. Yeah, it is. It is almost Masonic. It's almost Blavatsky theosophical, right? It takes on, you can't help but feel like this is a hanging man tarot journey, right? Of the speaker's idea at enlightenment, right? I mean, yeah, we wish that, we wish that, she could pray and, achieve peace and salvation in her own life. But she's it's so sad, man. It's so sad, right? And this poem, especially the occult imagery in this, is striking, right? Yeah, I'm sure. Yes, Rachel makes a good point. I'm sure that old Ted was a Mason. I mean, certainly. There's a famous picture of him standing there with Stephen Spender, W.H. Auden, and T.S. Eliot. I mean, yeah, of course, T.S. Eliot was a Mason. I don't know that, but I would speculate, right? T.S. Eliot was the head of Lloyd's Bank. And, these people had ties. He was the editor of Faber, and Ted Hughes going to Cambridge and all this stuff. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of illuminate, confirm imagery here. She says, the woman is perfected, right? The first line it reminds me of Black Swan, the movie, the Gnostic, Darren Aronofsky movie, The Black Swan, right? What does she say at the very end after she's done this dance macabre? She falls, right? At the end of the film, she falls and she says, it was perfect, or I'm perfect. So she's been perfected through her Gnostic quest, right? And she says the woman is perfected. Her dead, stanza break, body wears the smile of accomplishment. Well, I just realized that's kind of, that image reminds me of the Black Dahlia, right? Again, shout out to Jay's analysis. Black Dahlia and breakdowns and the tie-ins with the Black Dahlia and what was the guy's name? Dr. George Hodel, and the possible implications, right, of Hodel being the person who was trying to imitate the Man Ray art photography, but with bodies, and the smile of accomplishment, right? The illusion of a Greek necessity flows in the scrolls of her toga. This is a Sapphic image. This is pure Sappho. And Sappho, of course, we discussed Sappho in one of the earlier streams briefly. We could go back to Sappho. I think it was in terms of it was an Ezra Pound war poem stream, because the fragments of Sappho are sort of display Ezra Pound's idea of the fragmented nature of reality in early modernity and early modernism, and the fact that we can find fragments of poems, and they are whole poems now because it's all we have, but they are whole. The rest have been burned up. It's like the famous Ezra Pound poem, In a Station in the Metro. I don't know if you know that one. In a Station in the Metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough, he says. And he started off with that poem with a 200-line poem. It took years of just thinking and rewriting and revising. Finally, he got it down to a 2-line poem, 3 with the title. Because it's just a pure image. That's all the poem was, just pure image. And anyway, all that makes me think of this poem. It's almost like we're going to find this fragment after her death. And it represents her fragmented history, her fragmented psyche, her fragmented sense of self. Obviously, the white serpent is a pure Luciferian Gnostic image here. The pitcher of milk now empty. she has folded them back into her body as petals. She's talking about like she is the rose, she is the flower. What was it we read? Little flower petal. Is that Sylvia Plath? I got so many of these poems floating around in my head, you guys. Sometimes it's hard to make sense of. They're fragmented, right? It's just like the books we're reading. But that, from what we know of her biography now, is obviously this is preparation for her SUI side, right? Unfortunately. She says, the moon has nothing to be sad about. Staring from her hood of bone. What an original and dark image there, right? Now, obviously, we get the Diana, Artemis, Isis, moon goddess image, which she is identifying with, but her hood of bone. This I picture it as a crescent moon, right? Because it's as a hood covering the bone. I saw the moon the other night and thought of that Elliott Smith line. The moon is what is it? The moon is a broken light bulb, right? Sad to tie in Elliott Smith with Sylvia Plath because they both the same thing. They both meet the same end. But yeah, the hood of bone, she is used to this sort of thing. Her blacks crackle and drag. She's used to this sort of thing. Now we know from Lady Lazarus and from Daddy that she's used to it because this is a third time round. Third time's a charm, I hate to say, right? We've gone through Macbeth and the charm image. We also get a lot of Ophelia image in these two poems. The idea of the drowned woman. What does Jim Morrison say in his Ode to Brian Jones poem that he wrote in the book? I think it's in Lords and New Creatures or Wilderness. He says, Ophelia leaves sodden and silk, chlorine dream, mad stifled witness. The angel man finally claimed this benevolent soul. Obviously, Ophelia is a Hamlet image, but Sylvia Plath would identify with Ophelia committing SUI side, right? And we just got the water image of the previous poem. We could keep going, you guys. We've been going an hour and a half here. We could keep going. I could go through all of Sylvia Plath. I'd go through Lady Lazarus. Lady Lazarus is a pretty long poem. So I don't know. Maybe I'll wait. And maybe one day I'll get to talk to Rachel. We'll do an interview or something. And we can discuss Lady Lazarus because that is right up her alley with her expertise into this sphere. That would actually let's do that, right? Shout out also to David Patrick Harry at Church of the Eternal Logos, who's gone over a lot of this relevant material recently with Gnosticism, occult imagery. Last night he did a stream on the idea of the hag and fairy tales. So he's covered a lot of this. Do you guys want to take a dive into some Ted Hughes? Because we haven't done any of his poems, and I've got a lot of Ted Hughes. I already showed you. I didn't even bother to take the Ted Hughes down because I've got such a lot. I got a lot of it. Again, I'll just go back. This is Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being, which is the Hughes study of Shakespeare and his essays on Shakespeare specifically. I've got his selected poems up here, but I think here, maybe you can hear me if I look back here. So can you guys see me? Yeah. So this is birthday letters right here. This is birthday letters. 2 copies of that. Crow. I've got 3 copies of Crow up here. A 4th copy. I've got this is one of my favorite books right here. This is Ted Hughes. It's called Wadlow. And this one was incredibly hard for me to find. Finally got it in 2011, a first edition hardback. I've got a book on Sylvia Plath's ARIEL poems, another study right there. I've got this book right here. Rain Charm for the Duchy. He wrote this book in celebration of Prince Harry's life because he had become poet laureate and Prince Harry was born. So he read this at, I think, at the christening. He also wrote this poem right here, a birthday mask for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's 60th birthday. A birthday mask. Oops. Luminate confirm. Right? A little bit of eyes wide shut there, huh? Let's see. And anyway, I won't go over it, but he's got a bunch of other ones. Wolf Watching, Lupercal, The Hawk in the Rain, Crow, Moortown Diary. I've got all of his books. I got all those up there. And then I got a whole bunch of other ones. I've got Ted Hughes's collected poems, another collected poems. Anyway, whatever. I'm sorry for showing you the back of my head there, you guys. That's a big no-no in drama. Never show the back of your head unless it is intentional. Have you guys ever seen, we can take a little break here for a second. Have you guys ever seen, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch, you can YouTube the Michael Caine lesson about film acting and the secret to being a film actor. And you probably have seen it because it was kind of viral years and years ago. But Michael Caine says, listen, do you notice anything about what I'm doing right now? Do you notice it? This is the secret to film acting, right? If you notice, you look at me right now and I'm staring right into the camera because the camera is a character, right? You're a person. You have to make love to the camera. You have to, it's another person. Yeah, you have to be warm to the camera, but you'll notice that I've done one thing, or rather I haven't done one thing. And that is that no matter where I'm looking over here, I'm looking over here, I'm looking over here. Now I'm talking to you, right? But you'll notice that there's one thing I haven't done, and that's I haven't blinked, right? You cannot blink in the camera. You cannot blink, right? Master Wayne, there was rubies the size of grapefruits, and I haven't blinked. But if I'm going to blink, right, I have to say, oh, there's an explosion in the background. Oh, look, that was my chance. That was my chance to blink, right? Did you notice that? I used that. You don't blink. You don't want to waste the audience's time by blinking. So anyway, sorry for that terrible impression, but that is true, though. Yes, exactly, ADH. It didn't mean to blow the bloody doors off. Master Wayne. Tomorrow we rise at dawn. Tomorrow we ride at dawn. We ride at 6:30. Tomorrow we ride. Tomorrow we ride and we rise. All right, so let's go into, let's read a couple of Ted Hughes. Maybe we'll just stick with one or two Ted Hughes poems. And we're going to see, as I was speaking at the beginning of this poem about the violence of Ted Hughes's to bed. We rise at 7:30. 7:30 we rise at 7:30 to bed. Why don't we read, let's see. We could just read straight from Crow, because Crow is an incredibly dark, occult, Gnostic, animalistic, savage, Luciferian view of creation. It is incredibly dark. So we could read what Ted Hughes says about Crow. I guess we'll do that. I'll read a couple of poems from Crow. A couple of my favorite poems in here. And favorite in terms of not that I agree, okay, with his worldview, obviously. Not that, but I'm saying favorite in terms of the language and what I've learned about language from Ted Hughes and about poetry and about poetry writing, right? So why don't we read Ted Hughes's Crow's first lesson? Okay, now this one, you guys, this is strong. Okay, man, I'm telling you, JD, shout out to Jay's Analysis, would have a field day with the symbolism of this poem. So this is called Crow's first lesson. God tried to teach Crow how to talk. Love, said God, say love. Crow gaped, and the white shark crashed into the sea and went rolling downwards, discovering its own depth. No, no, said God, say love. Now try it. Love. Crow gaped, and a blue fly, a tsetse, a mosquito, zoomed out and down to their sundry flesh pots. A final try, said God. Now love. Crow convulsed, gaped, retched, and man's bodiless, prodigious head bulbed out onto the earth with swiveling eyes, jabbering protest. And Crow retched again before God could stop him, and woman's vulva dropped over man's neck and tightened. The two struggled together on the grass. God struggled to part them, cursed, wept. Crow flew guiltily off. Bet you didn't know it was going to be like that, did you? You didn't know Ted Hughes was going to wallop you right there, right? But you can see why women will have a problem with Ted Hughes. Yes, with words like that. Woman's vulva dropped over man's neck and tightened. Okay, so is he saying that man is strangled by women and by their sex and by sex, right? What we're actually saying here in the poem is this is a sort of an alternate, weird, clearly Gnostic view of the violence of creation, right? Where we have Ted Hughes would, people would probably call this, and they would say an Old Testament version of creation, right? Well, creation is in the Old Testament, and people will, as we know, will make that mistake in terms of their language and their perception and viewpoint of Christianity. But what we could say here is that, this is almost the deistic view of God, right? The clockmaker God who set something in motion and left is what Hughes is saying here. That's right. You got to watch out for that. Remember that episode of Seinfeld? He can't remember the girlfriend's name, right? He can't remember her name, and then he gets caught like looking in her wallet to see what her name is, and she says earlier in the episode she said her name rhymes with a female body part, and then she says, "You don't even know my name," and he says, "Mulva," and she gets pissed and leaves. And then at the very end, right, the joke at the very end is he says, "Oh, Dolores." But I like this line though. The white shark crashed into the sea. The white shark. First of all, that's the first time I read that poem is the first time I'd ever heard a shark, Carcarian, right? Shout out Ace Ventura. Referred to as a white shark and not a great white shark, right? So he takes away the great white shark, which is sort of the common modern view of the movie version of the shark, right? Of Jaws. We just get the white shark because it is singular, alone, and it is the predator, the first predator in creation, and it drops into the sea. And I like that image. I like that, right? We get creation. We get an element of creation violently falling into the sea, and we get what it is. Then we get, in the second stanza, we get this down to their sundry flesh pots. So we get the creation of the mosquito and the blue fly and all these disease-ridden pestilential animals. But we get it from the viewpoint of what DPH, David Patrick Henry, was talking about the other night in the Gnostic stream. And this reminds me of Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. There's a lot of like flesh pot imagery in that book, and it's extremely violent, bloody, and primordial. And I guess that's what he's getting at here, right? The fact that he continuously reiterates the words wretched and gaped and convulsed, right? Is indicative of the worldview espoused in this poem. specifically through Crow. Crow is a character in this poem that is kind of it's obviously like a serpent figure, right? But we all know the crow figure we all know the archetypal crow, right? We get the carrion bird. We get the ravens on the shoulders of Odin. We get crow imagery in Henry V and in Milton, in Marlowe, etc. A carrion bird. What was carrion bird in? That was a term in, I think it was Ezra Pound. Might have been Ezra Pound. But we also get this. What's TGF say here? He says, TGF, what'd you say? You said the blackbird as a chaotic demiurge is reminiscent of Abraxas and also of some Native American myths where the crow is both a trickster and a primordial light bringer. Thank you, sir. Yes, appreciate the insight into Abraxas. Not a shout out to Santana. That old boomer. But certainly the trickster figure, I mean, the crow we know we associate with the trickster figure, certainly. But that's what crow is throughout this poem. Let's read crow. Yeah, thank you, TGF. Appreciate it. Let's read Crow Tyrannosaurus. Crow Tyrannosaurus. Creation quaked voices. It was a cortege of mourning and lament. Crow could hear, and he looked around fearfully. The swift's body fled past, pulsating with insects and their anguish, all it had eaten. The cat's body writhed, gagging a tunnel of incoming death struggles, sorrow on sorrow. And the dog was a bulging filter bag of all the deaths it had gulped for the flesh and the bones. It could not digest their screeching finales. Its shapeless cry was a blort of all those voices. Even man, he was a walking abattoir of innocence, his brain incinerating their outcry. Crow thought, alas, alas, ought I to stop eating and try to become the light? But his eyes saw a grub, and his head, trap sprung, stabbed, and he listened, and he heard weeping, grubs, he stabbed, weeping, weeping. He walked and stabbed. Thus came the eyes' roundness, the ears' deafness. Holy shit, folks. I'm telling you. Look, you ever realize that your body is just it's an engine to carry around your brain pan. And your body is literally made up of all your ancestors. You're wearing a human skin suit made up of all your DNA and all the ancestors that ever came. Right? To become the light. Yeah, this book is almost like a Monarch programming manual, isn't it? It's like a Monarch programming manual with language like a secondary spiritual language of a Freemasonic journey of Illuminate confirmed. Right? What I really like about this poem is I try to keep this book pretty, I've taken this book everywhere with me, but I try to keep it pretty clean here. But what he says at the end here, look at the stanza. Look at the way that it looks on the page. So he breaks from form. He broke from them. He broke from them. And then he broke from himself. I've never seen a man so broken up and ripped apart. Right. He's breaking from the idea of he's breaking from reality. He's showing us this weird Gnostic version of creation where things in his worldview are broken. Right. And the lines will literally fragment and show the images. Right. And this is a great example of words, of poems being seen on the page and heard. Should we read one more, Ted Hughes, and then end it there? Let me find one here. Oh boy, yeah, I gotta read this one. This is also from Crow. You guys are gonna get this one. It's called "A Horrible Religious Error." When the serpent emerged, earth bowel brown from the hatched atom, with its alibi self-twisted around it, lifting a long neck and balancing that deaf and mineral stare, the sphinx of the final act, and flexing on that double flame flicker tongue, a syllable like the rustling of the spheres. God's grimace writhed, a leaf in the furnace, and man's and woman's knees melted. They collapsed, their neck muscles melted, their brows bumped the ground, their tears evacuated visibly. They whispered, "Your will is our peace." But Crow only peered, then took a step or two forward, grabbed this creature by the slack skin nape, beat the hell out of it, and ate it. I guess I probably don't need to comment on that poem. We get the caduceus image at the beginning there. We get the serpent and we get, the Satan figure here, and we get the crow. We get the crow as like what, an agent of destruction, a neo Lucifer, a scourge. But that's really disturbing, right? Their knees melt. Your will is our peace, but Crow only peered. What's he saying in this poem? Is he saying that they're bowing to God, or are they bowing to Lucifer? Right. The way you read it is that they in the poem is that they are bowing to the serpent. Your will is our peace. Right. This is sick. This is sick, right? You read Ted Hughes is in the canon of literature. He's one of the great modern poets in terms of one of the big modern poets. The guy was poet laureate. He was verifiable establishment, right? And these are his poems. They say that, Ted Hughes was he was not the original choice for poet laureate, but these things are chosen obviously very carefully. Poet laureate is a position for life, and getting becoming a poet laureate is like getting a Nobel laureate. What it does for a poet is, a poet hardly, if you ever read of a poet who can sustain himself through his literature, it's extremely rare, right? They usually have to teach. Ted Hughes taught. He occasionally taught. He wrote he wrote a lot. But he also went on book tours, and he gained his his prestige through constant publication. But he was obviously supported by the establishment, and being poet laureate or getting a Nobel laureate means, for one, that you will never have to worry about being published ever. Your books will be published forever. You'll always have that sticker on your book that says Nobel Prize for Literature winner. And, when you win a Nobel Prize, it used to be $1 million purse. You get $1 million, you get the little medal, right? But you get $1 million. Ted, the Pulitzer Prize in America is also a huge prize. There are various prizes in England, but Ted Hughes, gained his reputation and his money through his publication. And he is a great poet. I mean, he's obviously he's a great poet in the sense that he's a strong, powerful poet who knows he's a wordsmith, right? He will always be read. But we in this have been looking at his worldview and his what is the meaning, right? Through Ted Hughes. I mean, isn't all art about that? All art essentially is about two things, right? It's about our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. It's about why are we here and what are we doing while we're here? All art really is about that. And Ted Hughes certainly is about that, except for his view is this Gnostic, dark, occult Satan view of the world, full of violence and rage, right? So I hate to end it there. Let's end on a positive note, you guys. Hopefully, right after this stream is over, you'll go back and listen to some Babes in Toyland, Fontanelle, Bruise Violet. You'll listen to some Free Kitten and some Bikini Kill, and then you will listen to some La Tigra. Shout out to La Tigra, which became an electropop, an electro punk band in the 2000s. They came out with their album when I was living. I first saw them because I saw the poster when I was living in New York. I lived in the East Village in New York for a year when I was acting, and I remember seeing the poster plastered everywhere, La Tigra everywhere. And I said, is that Kathleen Hanna? I'd always had a thing for Kathleen Hanna. I thought she was cool. I like her name too. But yeah, she's this total, riot girl or whatever. She's now married to that dude from Beastie Boys. She married to Mike D. No, she's married to not Adam Yauch, I guess. Yeah, anyway. So yeah, they're part of their total establishment now, obviously. Jerry said, see what Jerry the Kang said, bro. Bays, I don't know, folks. Shout out to Jethro. I don't know, folks. This dude, Bays breathalyzer. I feel like I should have to pay for these streams. They're that good. Keep at it, bro. This is top tier. Well, thank you, sir. Listen, you can support by make sure you keep stocked up with those nutraceuticals. No, but for real, Jerry, I appreciate you, homeboy, and everybody. If you're watching this later in the psychosphere, if you're watching this in whatever year, right? If you're watching this in the dystopian wasteland out there, in years to come, or next week, or today, or tomorrow, make sure you go to Jerry at Exposed and Powerful Lies live streams and you check out his work. You should Google Rachel and buy her book on occult feminism. Rachel Wilson, based homeschool mom. You should check out all of our homies, especially, I'll continue to hawk this book. Esoteric. This book, Esoteric, is called Esoteric Hollywood by Jay Dyer. No, Jay Dyer. Jay Dyer, our friend Jay Dyer at Jay's Analysis, Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2. Great books that go very deep into film, especially film, literature, and conspiracy. So buy those books, obviously get signed copies over there. And please share this, put it on put it out there into the waves. And make sure people see it. Let's get our sub count up. Let's get some views. And if you got the coin, you guys, I sure would appreciate it. At my Cash App link, my PayPal link, especially my Cash App link, because I can get that right away. And we can start building the stream, get some equipment, get some Wi-Fi on a hotspot here, and buy some Red Bulls and some cigs. No, but seriously, I really could appreciate it, and I thank you for being here with me and for going on this journey with me, because I think it's cool. I think there's, let's just do this, right? It's a weekday night. It's dark outside. There's a lot going on in the world, but we can get away from it all, or in a way, get into it, because we see that all this stuff is revelatory, and, we're just going to stay dialed in. So I really appreciate it, you guys. Thanks for chilling with me, homies. Thank you if you're watching this later. I really appreciate it. Hope you sub to the channel. Hope you like my material, and we're going to keep going. We're going to go all through. We're going to do a whole lot of literature, right? There's an endless amount to do. So thank you, guys. I appreciate it. And I will see y'all tomorrow. Peace.